After the Civil War, federal troops were in the southern states to enforce Amendments 13 through 15, which abolished slavery and gave African Americans new rights as citizens. After the Compromise of 1877, the troops withdrew from the southern states, and the Southerners wished for white supremacy to return, but knew that they could not have slaves anymore. In order to bring back white supremacy, state legislation began creating the Jim Crow laws, whose goal was to separate African Americans from everyone else. The Jim Crow laws enforced segregation throughout many public facilities in the states in the North and the South, including parks, cemeteries, theaters, restaurants, hospital rooms, restrooms, hair salons, and schools. Additionally, Jim Crow laws deemed interracial marriage illegal, all in an effort to completely minimize contact between blacks and whites. Throughout 26 states, Jim Crow laws gained popularity and continued to spread, as well as gaining the backing of the courts. As a result of these Jim Crow laws, numerous court cases arose, such as Plessy v. Ferguson, Brown v. Board of Education, and Loving v. Virginia.
Well, growing up in Mississippi in the 50s and 60s, there were no people of color in our schools, in our neighborhoods. They did not use the same water fountains, bathrooms. My family had a clothing store. We had to have a separate dressing room for black women because white women would not change clothes in a dressing room that was used by black people. It was a way of life. It was happening before I was born, and so it just continued until the 60s when things changed with the board, with Brown versus the board and the Civil Rights Act.
Ferguson was a Supreme Court case in 1896 about segregation of train cars and other public spaces. The court ruled that so long as segregated facilities weren't inferior to white facilities, they didn't violate the Constitution. The idea of separate but equal segregated schools was the basis of the famous case, Brown versus the Board of Education. Topeka, Kansas. Oliver Brown first brought the case to the court. It began when Brown's daughter, Linda, had to walk an incredibly long distance to get to her segregated school. Linda had to walk many blocks and navigate through the Rock Island Railroad switching yard, which is a dangerous place for a young girl. Meanwhile, the all-white summer school was only 7 blocks away from her home. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP, helped Mr. Brown and several other parents who complained about the segregated schools file a lawsuit against the Board of Education of Topeka. Thurgood Marshall, the head of the NAACP, Legal Defense and Educational Fund, served as the chief attorney for the plaintiffs. In court, the Board of Education prevailed in the ruling by the U.S. District Court of Kansas because the buildings, transportation, and education were supposedly similar to those of the white schools, citing separate but equal from Plessy v. Ferguson. After the first hearing, Brown v. Board was argued twice in the Supreme Court, once in December 1952 and a year later in December of 1953. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court unanimously overturned the Plessy v. Ferguson ruling, claiming that, in the field of education, separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. The Supreme Court found segregated schools to be in violation of the 14th Amendment, which grants equal protection of rights to all American citizens. The court said that separate schools deprived African American children of equal educational opportunities. Not only that, but the school buildings themselves were significantly worse than the white schools. Americans had mixed feelings about the Supreme Court decision. Governor Herman Talmadge of Georgia, along with other Southern governors, fought against the ruling, promising that as a governor, he would never allow public schools to integrate. Other people supported the decision and felt it was a great step towards racial equality.
There was something called white flight. That meant that the white families decided for one of two reasons. Either there's no way my kid's going to sit in a class with black kids, or there's no way that those teachers are well trained because they didn't get the education that the white teachers got. So I don't want my kid's education compromised. So we're going to start private schools, and we're going to take all of our kids out, and they're going to go to private school. They're going to no longer be in the public schools. So that's kind of what happened.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was deemed necessary because of the discrimination towards African Americans and the public responses to them. One such event was the Freedom Riders, who were people who rode on integrated buses into the South to protest against the southern states' segregated busing practices. Although their protests were peaceful, the reactions from the Southerners wasn't. Freedom Rider buses were firebombed and the riders were beaten with pipes. Another problem that caused the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was James Meredith. James Meredith was an African-American Air Force veteran who enrolled into the University of Mississippi, which was an all-white school at the time. Knowing the opposition that enrolling an African-American would face from white Southerners, he was sent with 300 federal sheriffs to guard him. On the night of September 30th, 1962, a crowd of 1,000 students and Southerners rioted, throwing rocks and bottles and shooting guns near the main building of the college. 2 people died, and many of the sheriffs were wounded. The last reason was because of the Birmingham campaign. In April of 1963, MLK tried to desegregate Birmingham through protests to catch the government's attention. On April 3, 1963, he arranged 5 sit-ins in stores, but was arrested 9 days later. After being released 8 days later, he organized the Children's Crusade, where the children would march in protest. On May 2nd, the children marched as police were spraying them with hoses and letting dogs attack them. This event shocked the nation and prompted JFK to propose the Civil Rights Bill. Knowing the strength of the bill compared to previous civil rights laws that passed, the pro-civil rights senators knew that they needed to get a cloture, 2/3 a vote, in order to stop an inevitable filibuster, which was led by Richard Russell Jr. Problem was that the pro-civil rights Democrats and left-wing Republicans wouldn't reach 67 votes, so they would need to lure some moderates. With the help of Republicans, Dirksen and Kuchel, they were able to get the votes for a cloture to pass the law. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is split into 11 amendments or titles. The key titles are the following. Title I explains that everyone must be subjected to the same government-approved tests in order to vote. Title II forbids segregation of public places under the Jim Crow laws except for in privatized properties. Title IV describes the end of school segregation. Title VII bans employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, gender, or nationality. Title IX talks of how the Attorney General may help a case that he deems necessary to the public. Regarding Title II, the majority of the southern states abide by the law, but some states weren't as respectful, such as South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana, and Arkansas. The states of Alabama and Mississippi were actively disobeying the law. The court case Loving v. Virginia had a significant impact on the laws against discrimination and Jim Crow laws in the U.S. Richard and Mildred Loving were a mixed-race couple who fought against interracial marriage laws. Richard Loving was a white construction worker married to Mildred Loving, a black woman of Native American ancestry, whom Richard knew and loved his whole life. The Lovings were both born in Caroline County, Virginia, and deeply in love, and decided to get married in the year 1958. Since mixed marriage was illegal in Virginia, the Lovings drove up to Washington in order to get married where it was legal. They were officially husband and wife on June 2nd, 1958. 5 weeks after the Lovings returned to Virginia, they were woken up in their beds at 2 a.m. and thrown in jail. The Lovings were arrested on charges of violating the interracial marriage laws. The Lovings made an agreement with the judge that if they pled guilty, their charges would be dropped, but they would be forced to leave Virginia for 25 years. Unallowed to stay in Virginia, the Lovings moved to the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C. with Mildred's cousin. The Lovings raised 3 children in Washington, D.C., Peggy, Donald, and Sydney. However, the Lovings still longed to move back to Virginia. Mildred Loving then wrote a letter to Senator JFK to see if he could help with the Lovings gain the right to move back to Virginia. Senator JFK gave the Lovings case to the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, with lawyers John Herskop and Bernard Cohen. The Lovings first went to the original trial court in Virginia, asking for their sentence to be overruled. The judge then denied it, saying that God did not intend for races to mix. The Lovings were still determined to move back to Virginia, so they went to the Supreme Court of Virginia, where their case punishment was sustained and got appealed. The Lovings finally went to the Supreme Court of the United States, where interracial marriage laws was proven to violate the 14th Amendment and also the right to marry. This removed the interracial marriage laws from 16 different states and allowed the Lovings to move back to Virginia and live happily.